Winter, 1941. Lake Ladoga lies frozen solid under the Russian winter sun. A column of battered trucks crawls across the ice, each one a lifeline threading through hell itself. German artillery shells explode around them, sending up geysers of ice and water. Luftwaffe bombers scream overhead, their shadows racing across the frozen lake. But the trucks keep moving, carrying flour, ammunition, and hope to the starving city of Leningrad. These are GAZ-AA trucks, the workhorses that supported the survival of Leningrad's besieged population during the 872-day siege. But here is the paradox that changed history. Every bolt, every gear, every assembly technique in these Soviet lifelines is pure American engineering. This is the story of a secret, multi-million-dollar deal between American capitalism and Soviet communism, an unholy alliance that built Stalin's war machine and destroyed the lives of everyone who made it possible. To understand this road of life, we must trace the unlikely alliance forged 12 years earlier, a handshake between capitalism and communism that would reshape the world. The year was 1928, and the Soviet Union faced a terrifying reality. This vast nation, stretching across 11 time zones, possessed only 20,000 motor vehicles. 85% of their trucks and tractors were imported Fords, making them completely dependent on capitalist America for their industrial lifeblood. Stalin understood the vulnerability. Without modern industry, the Soviet Union remained a backward, agrarian nation. Easy prey for any mechanized army. His first 5-year plan demanded rapid industrialization, but the Soviets lacked the knowledge to build it themselves. Meanwhile, in Dearborn, Michigan, Henry Ford faced his own challenges. The Great Depression loomed, and his factories were filled with surplus equipment and older tooling that would soon be replaced by V8 production lines. Ford needed new markets. Ford, driven by his philosophy that the expansion of industry will ultimately benefit all people globally, agreed to transplant his industrial genius into the heart of communist Russia. On May 31, 1929, these two forces collided in an unprecedented agreement. The Soviet government signed a contract with Ford Motor Company worth $13 million, equivalent to roughly $200 million today. Ford would provide comprehensive technical assistance, sell vehicles and parts, and most crucially, help build a massive automobile plant on the banks of the Volga River. Stalin personally sent urgent coded telegrams demanding the deal be accelerated. He was not just buying trucks, he was purchasing the entire blueprint of American mass production. Ford dispatched his star architect, Albert Kahn, the man who had designed Ford's revolutionary River Rouge complex. Kahn's mission was staggering: create Soviet Detroit from scratch. Between 1929 and 1932, his firm would design over 500 factories across the USSR and train 4,000 Soviet engineers in American production methods. Frank Bennett and his team of American engineers arrived to find a construction site unlike anything they had experienced. Soviet workers labored around the clock in shifts, driven by Stalin's impossible deadlines. The plant had to be operational within 18 months, a timeline that would challenge even American efficiency. It was a race against time, and Stalin was holding the gun. The scale was breathtaking. Spanning over 285 hectares, the construction required 230,000 cubic meters of concrete. They installed over 6,000 machines and 8,000 electric motors across 52 interconnected shops, creating a factory that could produce 100,000 vehicles annually. Soviet workers, many of whom had never seen an assembly line, learned to build trucks using Ford's revolutionary methods. Following Kahn's River Rouge blueprint, the plant's true strength was its integrated design. Every component flowed seamlessly from raw materials to finished vehicles. The Americans brought more than just machinery. They imported an entire industrial philosophy of standardized parts, continuous flow production, and time and motion studies. Soviet engineers absorbed American production methods with remarkable speed. Engineers like Stepan Dybets, the plant's first director, worked closely with Bennett's team to absorb these methods. By 1932, the first GAZ-AA truck rolled off the production line. It was essentially a Ford Model AA, built from American knockdown kits but adapted for Soviet realities. The design featured a simplified 40-horsepower engine, a 4-speed transmission, and a payload capacity of 1.5 tons, perfect for the rough roads. Clever adaptations for scarcity were made, single headlights instead of pairs, and wooden cab components to save steel. The GAZ-AA, nicknamed the Polotorka or half-truck, began rolling out at 60 vehicles per day. Soviet engineers proved remarkably adept, with shock worker movements pushing output even higher. Alexander Buzygin's team famously forged 1,001 crankshafts in a single day compared to their daily plan of 675. By 1935, the 100,000th GAZ vehicle rolled off the production line. The transformation was staggering. The GAZ-AA became the backbone of Soviet transportation, used for everything from agriculture to military logistics. But this industrial triumph carried a dark shadow. As production soared, Stalin's paranoia began to focus on the very people who had made it possible. In Stalin's mind, the men who knew how to build it were the only men who knew how to break it. The factory that Ford built had succeeded beyond all expectations. And if you want to see more stories like this, subscribe, because you'll see how this factory would soon run red with the blood of its creators. By 1932, the Gorky plant was exceeding all expectations. Production lines hummed with efficiency, turning out nearly 1 million GAZ-AA trucks over the following 6 years. The Soviet Union had achieved industrial self-sufficiency in record time, and the American specialists who had made it possible were celebrated as heroes of socialist construction. But Stalin's mind worked differently than other men's. Success bred suspicion. The very efficiency of the Gorky plant, its American origins, and the foreign specialists who had built it began to appear sinister through the lens of his growing paranoia. The Great Terror began quietly in 1932, escalating through the mid-1930s as Stalin consolidated power through fear. The initial targets were kulaks and political opponents, but the campaign soon expanded to include anyone with foreign connections or specialized knowledge that might threaten the state. American workers had been lured to the Soviet Union by promises that seemed too good to be true, and they were. Soviet recruiters had advertised double wages, free housing, free health care, and free passage for entire families. Thousands of skilled workers, desperate during the Great Depression, saw this as their salvation. Victor Herman, a young American who had arrived with his family in 1931, later described the gradual transformation from welcome to imprisonment. Initially treated as honored guests, the Americans found themselves increasingly isolated. Their passports were confiscated for safekeeping. They were required to sign documents renouncing their American citizenship to receive work permits. Frank Bennett, the Ford engineer who had overseen the plant's construction, was among the first to disappear. He was seized by NKVD during the height of the Great Terror, likely between 1936 and 1938, on vague charges of treason or espionage. His crime was simply knowing too much about American production methods and maintaining contact with Ford headquarters. Bennett vanished into the Gulag system, never to be seen again. The American embassy in Moscow began receiving desperate pleas from stranded workers. Families begged for help, describing how their relatives had been taken in the night by black NKVD vans. Embassy staff could hear the gunshots of execution squads echoing through Moscow's streets, but diplomatic protocol prevented intervention. Lovett Fort Whiteman, an African-American communist who had enthusiastically embraced the Soviet experiment, found himself facing charges of Trotskyism and counter-revolutionary activity. Despite his ideological commitment, he was executed at the Butovo firing range in 1939 one of thousands of foreigners who had come to build socialism and instead found death. The purges extended beyond Americans to Soviet engineers who had worked too closely with foreign specialists. Stepan Debets, the plant's first director and one of the most capable industrial leaders in the Soviet Union, was arrested in 1937. His expertise in American production methods, once celebrated, was now evidence of treasonous foreign influence. He was shot as an enemy of the people. The irony was devastating. The very knowledge that had made Soviet industrialization possible was now branded as sabotage. Engineers who had successfully adapted American techniques were accused of deliberately introducing defects. Specialists who had trained under Ford's team were condemned as spies. Even as the terror consumed its architects, production at Gorky continued to surge. The GAZ-AA's simple, robust design proved perfect for mass production, even amid chaos. New workers, often untrained peasants, could learn to assemble the trucks quickly. The factory's American-designed systems were so efficient, they functioned despite the human catastrophe unfolding around them. Meanwhile, Western leaders who should have known better denied what was happening. Henry Ford himself dismissed reports of purges as anti-Soviet propaganda. President Roosevelt, eager to maintain diplomatic relations, ignored embassy cables describing the fate of American workers. The very people who had praised Soviet industrial progress refused to acknowledge the blood price of that success. By 1938, virtually all the American specialists who had built the Gorky plant were dead, imprisoned, or had fled. Their Soviet colleagues had suffered similar fates. The factory they had created continued producing trucks that would soon prove essential to Soviet survival, but the creators had been consumed by the system they had helped build. The purges were over, but a far greater enemy was already massing on the border. The GAZ-AA trucks rolling off the production lines carried within their steel frames the ghosts of the men who had made them possible. The men who built the GAZ-AA were gone, but their engineering lived on, and now their creation was about to face the ultimate test. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa shattered the dawn across the Eastern Front as 3 million German soldiers launched the largest military invasion in history. Within weeks, Army Group North had surrounded Leningrad, cutting off the Soviet Union's second-largest city from the outside world. 2.5 million civilians found themselves trapped in a siege that would last 872 days. Food supplies dwindled rapidly after German bombers destroyed 6 months' worth of provisions in a single devastating air raid. By winter, Leningraders were dying of starvation at a rate of 3,000 people per day. The only lifeline was Lake Ladoga, a massive body of water that froze solid during the brutal Russian winter. Soviet logistics officers realized that trucks could traverse the ice, carrying supplies into the besieged city and evacuating civilians to safety. But they needed vehicles capable of handling the treacherous conditions, trucks that were reliable, simple to maintain, and available in massive quantities. The GAZ-AA proved perfect for this desperate mission. The Red Army possessed over 200,000 trucks at the war's outbreak, and the vast majority were GAZ-AAs produced at the Gorky plant. Their Ford-derived design, simplified for Soviet conditions, made them ideally suited for the harsh demands of the ice road. The Road of Life became operational in November 1941, as temperatures plummeted below -40 degrees Celsius. GAZ-AA drivers navigated by compass across the frozen lake, following routes marked by pine branches stuck in the ice. German artillery constantly shelled the road while Luftwaffe bombers attacked the slow-moving convoys. The first weeks were catastrophic. The ice wasn't thick enough to reliably support fully loaded trucks. In the very first week alone, 40 trucks plunged through the surface, taking their drivers and precious cargo to the bottom of Lake Ladoga. Within another week, that number had tripled. Drivers quickly developed a terrifying survival technique. They would stand on the footboards and steer through the open door, ready to jump clear if the ice broke. Over the entire operation, more than 1,000 trucks would be lost, but the road stayed open. Soviet engineers adapted quickly, learning to read ice conditions and adjust loads accordingly. As winter deepened and the ice thickened, the GAZ-AA trucks found a rhythm. Convoys of dozens of trucks would cross simultaneously, their engines running continuously to prevent freezing. Drivers developed techniques for navigating shell craters and avoiding thin ice, turning the lake crossing into a deadly but essential routine. The statistics tell the story of survival. During the winter of 1941 to 1942, the Road of Life operated for 152 days. GAZ-AA trucks delivered 360,000 tons of supplies into Leningrad: flour, ammunition, fuel, and medicine that kept the city alive. They evacuated over 554,000 people, mostly children and elderly civilians who couldn't survive another winter of siege. Beyond Leningrad, GAZ-AAs formed the logistical backbone of the entire Soviet war effort. From the Gorky plant, supply lines stretched across thousands of miles to frontline positions. These trucks hauled components for Katyusha rocket launchers, transported tank parts to assembly plants, and moved troops to critical battles. The supply chain that began with Henry Ford's blueprints in Detroit now stretched from the Volga to Stalingrad, from the Urals to the gates of Berlin. Soviet factories, many designed by Albert Kahn's the firm, produced everything from aircraft engines to artillery shells. GAZ-AAs connected this vast industrial network, ensuring that weapons and supplies reached the front lines. The truck's wartime production peaked at 176,221 vehicles as the Gorky plant adapted to produce military variants. The basic design proved so versatile that it could be quickly modified for specialized military roles. As Soviet forces began pushing German armies westward, GAZ-AAs followed, carrying the supplies that sustained the Red Army's advance toward Berlin. The trucks that had saved Leningrad were now part of the massive logistical machine that would ultimately crush the Wehrmacht. June 1944. Moscow's oppressive summer heat couldn't diminish the significance of the meeting taking place in the Kremlin. Eric Johnston, president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, sat across from Joseph Stalin, discussing the war effort that had turned decisively in favor of the Allies. Johnston praised the remarkable Soviet industrial capacity that had sustained 4 years of brutal warfare. Stalin listened, then offered a response that revealed the hidden truth behind Soviet victory. Stalin said that the United States is a country of machines. Without the use of those machines through Lend-Lease, we would lose this war. But Stalin went further, acknowledging a debt that predated the war by more than a decade. He called Henry Ford one of the world's greatest industrialists, and, in a moment of startling irony for the atheist dictator, he added, "May God preserve him." This was more than mere diplomatic courtesy. Stalin knew Ford's 1929 technology transfer had created the industrial foundation that made Soviet survival possible. Every aspect of Soviet wartime production, from the assembly lines churning out vehicles to the strategic materials reaching the front, depended on the manufacturing revolution that had begun with Ford's blueprints 15 years earlier. The acknowledgement came with bitter irony. Stalin praised Ford by name before the world, calling him one of history's greatest industrialists. Yet Frank Bennett, Stepan Debets, and hundreds of other engineers who had actually implemented Ford's vision were erased from history, their names unspoken, their contributions forgotten, their very existence denied by the state they had served. As the war ended, the GAZ plant evolved into the Soviet Union's automotive powerhouse. The facility that had begun as a copy of River Rouge became a symbol of Soviet industrial might, producing millions of vehicles over the following decades. But the plant's American DNA remained embedded in its design, a permanent reminder of the technology transfer that had changed history. The GAZ-AA itself became legendary, serving not just as transportation, but as a symbol of Soviet resilience. Veterans who had driven the road of life spoke of their trucks with the affection reserved for comrades who had shared mortal danger. The simple, reliable design that Ford engineers had created for American farmers had proven perfect for the most demanding conditions imaginable. By 1948, the Gorky plant had produced 829,808 GAZ-AA trucks, each one a descendant of Henry Ford's original Model AA. The production run represented more than mere manufacturing statistics. It embodied the transformation of an agrarian nation into an industrial superpower capable of defeating the Wehrmacht. Remarkably, many of these Ford-derived trucks would remain in service for decades, a permanent, rolling monument to a forgotten American alliance. The broader legacy extended far beyond trucks. Albert Kahn's architectural principles, implemented across 500 Soviet factories, had created the manufacturing empire that sustained the USSR throughout the Cold War. The mass production techniques learned from Ford's engineers became the enduring bedrock of Soviet industrial might. Yet this triumph remained forever tainted by the human cost. The engineers who had built Soviet industrial power were systematically erased, their expertise branded as treason, their names struck from the record. Victory over fascism had come at the price of the very people who had made that victory possible. The GAZ-AA represented the ultimate paradox of industrial power, a force capable of both creation and destruction, depending on the hands that wielded it. Subscribe if you want more hidden stories of industrial paradox and the machines that changed history.